Greetings, my name is Stephan Haggard. I teach at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm going to be moderating our program tonight on the Ukraine crisis. Given that the large number of you have signed up for this, we're very gratified about that. We're going to give a minute for people to get into the webinar, and then we'll start with some brief introductions. Just give us 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm assuming that most people have gotten in. First, let me give a brief introduction to the School of Global Policy and Strategy for those of you who are not familiar with it. We're a degree granting institution. We offer mainly master's programs in international affairs and public policy. We also have professional training, a one-year master's program for professionals and specialized degrees relating to China. We have a particularly strong faculty in the Asia Pacific and Latin America. We also work on global problems such as climate change and public health. And obviously, the issue before us tonight, Ukraine, was something we felt we needed to speak on. And so let me, before I introduce the panel tonight, just give a heads up about a couple of other events that are coming at UCSD that we would very much invite you to consider. Our colleagues in the working on European studies, the Center for European Studies, are putting together a panel later in the week on Thursday, midday, that will look at these questions from a European perspective. And next week, we'll be hosting a seminar on the China dimensions of this, the China-Russia dimensions. So the date for that hasn't been set yet, but please take a look at the GPS website and we'll put up a banner for that. So let me introduce our panel tonight and tell you about how we're going to proceed. First of all, if you have questions during the course of the talk, please feel free to post them in the Q&A. I'll be trying to monitor the Q&A, and our colleagues on the call will be able to see it as well. And to the extent that we can address your questions, that's actually the main thing we seek to do. But let me introduce the panelists in the order that they'll present. And in doing so, give you some sense of the questions we want to talk about this evening. We're going to be led by Bronislaw Slonchev, who's in the Department of Political Science. He's one of the leading game theorists in the United States who works on international security. He's the author of a book called Military Threats, the Costs of Coercion and the Price of Peace, which couldn't be more timely, obviously. And he's going to lead off by talking about Putin's motives and why this is happening at this particular time, and how the military situation might result in a negotiated settlement or not. We're then going to turn to Lauren Prather, who's a professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. She's written extensively on issues of election monitoring and democracy and autocracy, transitions between different types of regimes. And she's going to address one of the most significant questions, which is how the authoritarian democratic divide is implicated in the Ukraine crisis. Third, we're going to be turning to the economic dimension of this. And I'm particularly pleased to introduce our new dean, Carolyn Freund. She's an expert on the world economy. Prior to joining GPS, she was the director of a unit at the World Bank that worked on trade, investment, and competitiveness. And she's going to be leading us through a discussion of some of the implications of sanctions, both for Russia and for the world economy. And then finally, GPS prides itself on having faculty who have had distinguished professional careers. And we're joined tonight by one of those, Vice Admiral Charles Martoglio, spent 40 years in the Navy. But what's particularly interesting for us is he not only held a series of appointments at the Pentagon dealing with strategic planning issues, but he was also deputy commander of US Eurasia Command, which is responsible for US forces in Europe and Eurasia. Bronislaw, why don't you get us started? Each panelist will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. And we'll just move through, and then we'll take as many questions as we can. Bronislaw?
Okay, hi, I hope you can hear me. So very quickly, because we don't have much time, obviously I cannot read Putin's mind when we discuss the goals. So what I will do is list a few of the security, economic, and political causes that he and his government has offered. And I would like to also address how much they're likely to be actually the driving cause, and then discuss what I think is going on and why the prospects for peace might look extremely dim at this point in time. So the first one, and the one that has been most commonly offered, and very actually it's been around for a while, is that this is caused by the post-Cold War NATO expansion eastwards. And the reason for this is very simple, really. If you look at the map, what you will see is that the European plain extends essentially from the low, it's like a funnel. It starts in the low countries and then starts widening toward Russia. And as you go further and further toward Russia, the longer the border that the Russians will have to defend if they're invaded from the west. And of course, they have been very sensitive about being invaded from the west. I grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, so I learned Russian history back then, or what passed for Russian history. And there's a lot of talk about these kinds of events. Back to Sweden in 1707, France in 1812, Poland in 1920, Germany, of course, twice in 1914 and 1941. And they've been very sensitive about this throughout history. This is true for Imperial Russia, it is true for the Soviet Union, and Putin at least claims it is true today. If you look again at the map, you will see that the border is about this flat area through which armies can move is about 300 miles wide in Poland, between the Baltic and the Carpathians. And then it very quickly widens to a 2,000-mile front, which of course in some sense helps the Russians, because every time who's invaded Russia has found out that it is a big country. But in terms of defense, they've always been wanting to secure these kind of frontiers, further push them out away from Moscow. The one problem they have always had, however, is that they have found no way, no Imperial, Soviet, or Putin's Russia, to have these, what they call buffer states or cordon sanitaire, to be both provide security for Russia, but also allow them self-determination. So that's been a perennial problem, because if you're in one of these places, if you live in the Baltics, if you live in Poland, if you're Ukrainian, if you're Bulgarian, what the Russians have seen repeatedly is that left to their own devices, the governments very quickly turn pro-Western. And there's two reasons for this. One is security, in terms of Russia is simply very big, and if it decides to do anything militarily to them, none of them can stand up to them. And that generates a fear, obviously. And either you accommodate the Russians completely, and even then there's no guarantee you won't disappear from the map, or you seek some sort of alliances to the West. And in terms of the economy, Russia has traditionally been a lot behind Western Europe, so it hasn't been an attractive trade partner for most other things. And so as a result, governments very often immediately turn pro-Western. Yes, I accidentally pressed the space bar. What Stalin did in 1945, of course, is impose communist regimes. That was the solution at the time, that they will guarantee that these countries kind of stay in the Soviet sphere of influence. And of course, that is part of the reason the United States adopted this policy of containment, where we allowed them, agreed essentially to allow this, but had drawn the line in Eastern Europe. Now, so the problem with this theory is that it is simply incompatible with, as I pointed out, allowing national self-determination to these buffer states. And although from great power politics, if you're sitting in an armchair in Western Europe or in the US, it seems, yeah, it's okay. If you live in one of these countries, it's a serious problem, as we're finding out today. Why do I think this is not really a cause for Putin? Is that in order to believe that this is still valid, you need to agree to several things today. So first of all, conquest simply doesn't pay. We have had very profitable relations with Russia, the world. NATO, after the end of the Cold War, has been trying to find a new purpose of exactly what the alliance is supposed to do. Of course, the war on terror for a while seemed like this. And the European Union has been bending over backwards to accommodate Putin. And that's because of the German position in there. So it's very difficult to understand exactly what threat the Russians are seeing in the West. You have to project quite a bit. Then very quickly on to the economic reasons. Of course, the seizure of Crimea is one of the big problems for Russia is they don't have warm water ports, and Sevastopol is just one of them. They need the Black Sea to gain access through the straits to world markets and the trade routes. And of course, this is why the Russian Empire had fought, 12 wars with the Ottoman Empire over the centuries, why they have these policies in the Balkans, things like this. So we can understand the reason for taking Crimea. Of course, they've discovered gas there the last 10 years, so in the Black Sea, so there's a lot of energy issues that we may want to discuss. The other, of course, stated purpose is to undermine the European Union in particular, not just NATO. And this is why Russia has been supporting fascist, essentially right-wing parties across Europe. That's why they welcomed Brexit, and that's why they've been trying to sow dissent in the West. So that's one of the stated goals. And of course, then there's the immediate pretext for protecting the Russians in the Donbass region, with this kind of denazification calls and things like this. I just want to point here, flag it. I would be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, that you have to be very careful with this. The media tends to portray the eastern Ukraine as being populated by Russians. That is not true. They're actually, most of them, the vast majority of them are Ukrainians who speak Russian. When in the referendum of 1991, over 83% in eastern Ukraine approved independence, and subsequent polls showed consistently extremely high support, 78 to 80%, for not being alive, not joining Russia or anything like this. So you have to be very careful when we talk about this. So my point is that we need to take Putin at his word when he says that what he wants is to essentially destroy Ukraine as an independent country, especially a democratic, Western-oriented country. It's just, it is intolerable, democracy. I'm sure my colleagues will speak more to this, to his regime. It's a huge threat because it provides an example of an alternative to the middle class in Russia, and that destabilizes him internally quite a bit. He also needs to provide an example to an alternative to democracy, which of course democratic decline people have been talking quite about this. You have people like Orban in Hungary and in Poland with democratic backsliding, and Putin was kind of their leader in this global movement, so he needs to show that this works, which is why it's one of the reasons that we need to oppose this. Now, very quickly, I just want to mention why it was thought that this is the good time to do this and why he thought that the war would be easy. This is the classic case, I think, of military optimism. Despite there's a tremendous military advantage, he thought that he would be able to present essentially the world with a fait accompli. Essentially that they will go in, it will take just a few days, the government will run away or fall, they'll install a regime like they did in Chechnya after their last war, and then this regime is going to do the dirty work of dealing with any fallout, which of course they expected there will be some resistance. So I'll be happy to talk about why this did not quite work out and what history of why the support for Russia did not materialize in Ukraine. There are certain kinds of two unpredictable factors here that even we did not expect. First, the extremely effective strategy of the US government to organize and mobilize the West in a united, given a united front to Russia, which I think I'm a specialist in this and I was just stunned by this, how quickly and how effective this has been, especially organizing wide-reaching unprecedented sanctions. Then, of course, Zelensky's own stand that rallied the Ukrainian people very early on. So we expected essentially a long insurgency. Now people are talking, maybe the Russians cannot even defeat Ukraine militarily at this point, let alone the insurgency afterwards. Unfortunately, what this means, given his unlimited goal for Ukraine, is that there's very little room for bargaining at this point. The latest demands they made are completely incompatible with what's happened on the ground. The Russians have not softened their view of what they expect. And in fact, given how successful so far the Ukrainians have been in keeping them from taking cities or occupying territory, especially in the north, they've been much more successful in the south, obviously, where there's not much mud, so they can actually move their vehicles. It's actually the Ukrainians that are going to be an obstacle to, they will not surrender. When people say, just give these autonomous regions, make them independent and things like this, again, remember, there are millions actually of Ukrainians there, and the government in Kiev is extremely unlikely to actually capitulate to demands like this.
Bronislaw, this was, I'm sorry to sort of jump in, but it's just such a perfect segue into what I'd like Lauren to address, which is this question of regime type, which was ran through your comments. Lauren, do you want to pick up on some of the themes that Bronislav has raised with respect to democracy and autocracy in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks for a nice analysis of the events, Bronislav. So I want to take a slightly wider scope to answer or to reflect on the question of why now, and relate it to the perceived threat to Putin from democratic changes in Ukraine and in the Soviet Russia sphere in general. So if we take a longer view, if we go back, about 10 years ago, the Obama administration, the United States, took a harder line against Russia and Putin in general, and also started to sort of ramp up support for civil society, support for opposition parties in Russia. And I think this was viewed rightfully so by a personalist dictator in Russia as a threat to his power, as a threat to himself personally. And so, again, like Branislav, I can't read Putin's mind, but, as someone who has studied regime type and democracy, this would be viewed as quite threatening. And then you also have, in conjunction with that, a start to a series of revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, where there really did seem to be a turn in orientation towards democracy, towards the West, towards the EU. So I viewed sort of the 2014 incursion into Crimea as a bit of a test of the international waters, so to speak, to see how sort of the West would respond to, attempts at territorial conquest, attempts to, grab hold of a piece of Ukraine. And frankly, there was not a strong response at that point. There were sanctions, but I think the response was not as strong as it could have been. So then you enter the 2016 election in the United States, and I've just finished writing a book on election meddling. And the way I talk about Russia and Putin's strategic decision to meddle in U.S. elections is that there really were not any downsides to Putin to doing so. If one of his objectives was to install a friendly U.S. president, he attempted to do so using various attacks on U.S. democracy to help the Republicans and help Trump come to power. But the reason I don't think there was any downsides was, even if that attempt wasn't successful, I think undermining democracy, sowing chaos in consolidated democracies like the United States, like those in Western Europe, was compatible with his regime objectives, regardless if he was successful at getting Trump elected. Because again, if you view this through the lens in Russia that democracy is a threat to Putin, then being able to point to Western democracies that have been longstanding and demonstrating the chaos in these democracies to his own people is a way to further motivate them to stick with his regime. Okay, so now enter the friendly Trump presidency. The question is sort of, why doesn't Putin at that time attempt what he's doing now in Ukraine? And I actually think the idea in using Trump or working with Trump was to actually achieve some of his current goals in a lower cost way. This is an extremely costly thing that Putin has done. And if he could have achieved undermining NATO, undermining the EU, even testing Zelensky, right, using the Trump administration or working with the Trump administration to do so, that's a much lower cost way of achieving his objectives, or at least furthering his objectives, right? The problem ended up, though, that Zelensky didn't cooperate, right? He ended up in 2019, after he was elected, when he was sort of presented with the opportunity to work with the Trump administration to provide evidence of against the Democratic Party in support of Trump's election in 2020, he refused to do so. And I think this, in a sense, Zelensky failed the test, right? And so I think that also indicated potentially to Putin that he was not going to have a cooperative leader in Ukraine that he could work with. So in terms of why now, he wasn't, I think, able to get as much as he wanted during that period where he had a friendlier U.S. president in power, even though we had Brexit, even though we did see some disorganization in NATO. And then the other thing we had, obviously, was COVID. So that was a distraction and a big problem in Russia. But perhaps even a bigger problem for Putin, I think, was if he did actually have these goals, as Branislav outlined, of taking over Ukraine completely, one of the best ways to do so for him militarily is to be able to use Belarus in terms of strategic entry point. If you look at the map, Kiev is very close to Belarus. Being able to amass an army at the border with Belarus to be able to quickly get to Kiev, I think was militarily advantageous. But the problem for Putin was that in 2020, there was also an election in Belarus. And Lukashenko, the president there, had, it was an election with a lot of international attention. The president won, but there were a lot of claims of fraud in Belarus, millions of people on the street protesting the election. And Putin supporting Lukashenko, even though many people in the international community believed his election to be fraudulent. So after that died down, Lukashenko had a stronghold on power and now was able to kind of return the favor to Putin and support this military incursion into Ukraine from Belarus. So that's sort of my long-term view. And I think, again, this kind of, to me, answers the question of why now, but also really helps to answer the question and clarify to me something that I've seen a lot of discussion of, which is Putin rational? And I think if you put all of this together, I think there's a very logical cohesion to this strategic moves he's made, at least over the last 10 years. So I don't have much to say right now on the question of where this goes. I'm happy to speculate, but that's my interpretation of events.
Lauren, very useful. And Carolyn, while you're sharing your slides, let me just set up a little bit where Carolyn's going to lead us. Because the whole question of democracy is also tied up with relationships, economic relationships between Ukraine and Europe, Ukraine and Russia, and then the instruments that the United States and Western Europe have deployed have not primarily been military ones, they've been economic ones. So Carolyn, why don't you take us into that discussion?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Great. So let me just start by saying that I'm a trade economist, not a Russia or Ukraine expert. But I want to talk a bit about sanctions. And I think a point that I really want to highlight is that the response has been strong, but I think it's a little bit overblown of how impactful it's actually going to be because of the carve out for energy. So let's just first think about what sanctions do. They're the removal of commercial relations to achieve a foreign policy goal. They work by provoking economic hardship, which depends on the extent to which you cover the, the extent to which you, all goods are covered that a country exports or imports, so international relations are covered. The tightness, can they be bypassed through other countries or technologies? And the preparation, how self-sufficient is the country in question? But the experience with sanctions is pretty poor. So if you look at the countries where we've tried sanctions, you don't typically see the foreign policy goal being achieved, and certainly not rapidly. And studies have found that they actually achieve foreign policy goals in less than 20% of the cases. The best example probably being South Africa. So just quickly, what are the main sanctions on Russia? The two big ones are freezing reserves held in the G7. Russia has about $630 billion in reserves, about half of which have been frozen. But this is based on old data, and they could have moved a lot before the incursion. And then the largest Russian banks cannot use SWIFT. So this means they can't make cross-border payments, so you can't trade easily with Russia. And then there are other ones in addition. But there's this big loophole, which is transactions involving energy exports have been exempted. Well, why is that? Why is energy excluded? Well, Russia is the biggest exporter in the world of oil and natural gas, accounting for about 11% in world markets. And who are the big importers? They're important countries like China, Japan, India, Korea, Germany, and many of the sanctioning countries. So they're highly dependent on energy. US is the only reasonably self-sufficient country, but still depends on the world price. Now, excluding energy is extremely lucrative for Russia. The price has already climbed to $120 a barrel. So if you look at the average price in 2012 at its height was 112, less than it is today, and energy was 70% of exports. Over this whole period, from 2007 to 2020, energy was 60% of Russia's exports. So right now, even if you include the broad group of sanctioning countries beyond EU, US, including countries like Australia, Canada, et cetera, only 15% of Russia's exports are actually covered. And if the oil price reaches 150, as many are estimating, their earnings from oil and gas would exceed their average total exports over the period. So that price would offset a big part of the sanctions on non-oil. Sanctions can also have unintended consequences. They're pushing Russia and China closer. They're natural trading partners. China's share of Russia's exports increased dramatically since 2007 from 4 to 15%, and their share of Russia's imports doubled over this period. They could hasten, the sanctions themselves could hasten the formation of alternatives to dollar and SWIFT. We're already hearing about either crypto, renminbi, as well as other messaging services. Depreciation, the ruble, I think, has fallen by about 50% today. But that hurts people more than the government because the government gets its money in dollars still from selling oil. And depreciation encourages self-sufficiency because imports outcompete foreign goods. While they can promote anger at the government, they can also lead to nationalism and anger at the sanctioned sending countries and hurt sending countries and innocent bystanders. And this is the last point I want to make, which is really about grains, the other major market being impacted currently. 2 of the top 10 exporters of grain are Russia and Ukraine. And the grain importers include, again, China, very dependent, as well as many, again, of the sanctioning countries. So grain is also being impacted as Ukraine is stopping to plant. It's considered the breadbasket of Europe, and what will happen there. But I think importantly for the world economy, it's really the poor countries that are going to get squeezed here. So while the biggest importers are countries like China, the countries that really depend on imports of energy and imports of grain for their livelihood tend to be the poorest small countries in the world. And another food crisis could be on the horizon. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, Caroline, I think it's just so great, you know, your World Bank background. I don't think this story about the effects on commodities has been adequately appreciated. And we're already seeing those effects in food prices and markets that have been heavily dependent on Ukrainian and Russian grain, particularly in the Middle East. So you know, I think this is something crucial. Charlie, we're going to pull back and give the microphone to you and talk a little bit about the NATO response, not on the sanctions side, but with respect to political cooperation and perhaps military cooperation as well. We've got a number of questions in the chat on those issues that I'm going to direct to you. So
Great.
why don't you take 5 or 7 minutes? Yeah.
Thank you, Steph. What I'd like to do is, as Steph indicated, I want to take a look from a national policy perspective of what we as a United States government, along with our NATO and coalition partners, are trying to achieve. And this is along the ideas of what is the big strategy for getting to a satisfactory mid-state or end state. So as you look at, and as my colleagues have indicated already, Putin's objectives. And I'm going to go further than my colleagues have and say that this idea of a USSR-like Russian sphere of influence has been in his mind since 2005, as evidenced by his participation in the Munich Security Conference in 2007, by his cyber attack into then NATO member Estonia in 2007, by his kinetic, conventional, and gray forces attack into Georgia in 2008, by his Crimea campaign and Eastern Ukraine in 2014, by his willingness to send his military forces into Belarus in 2021 for repressing population, the same thing in Kazakhstan in 2022, and now into Ukraine. So there is this long history built around President Putin where he is looking to recreate a USSR-like Russian sphere of influence. The Russians last year in 2021 put out a new Russian national security strategy. As you read it, one of the things that comes through the many filters that people look at it is that Putin's vision for Russia is as an independent, co-equal great power on the world stage, subordinate to no one, including China, in a multipolar world where Russia is one of the poles. And you take both of these objectives and you put them together and you can see what is driving Putin. So when I get asked, is Putin crazy? Is he stable? My response is Putin is on a crusade. And when you're on a crusade, you are objective focused, and guardrails often either move to the side or come off. I suspect at this point, Putin doesn't know how far he is going to go. And I say that because being objective focused, he knows where he wants to go, but crusaders will go until they run out of energy. And he doesn't know where he's going to run out of energy yet. So even he doesn't know whether he's looking at annexation, a puppet government and occupation, a puppet government with strong security forces, occupation east of the Dnieper River, building a bridge to the Crimea through the separatist areas in the east, or just the east? Or does he destroy Ukraine and then back off and say, I told you so, and I'll come back if you do it again? So that's kind of the range of options that he has. Clearly, everything he has done to this point has been beyond, to the right of what conventional wisdom thought he was going to do. I don't think Putin today knows where he's going to run out of energy. As several of the speakers have said, he has been surprised by the opposition, not only in Ukraine, but the rapidity with which the world has come together in terms of the issues they've come together and the number of nations that have come together. So that's where President Putin's mind is focused. As a strategist now, let's shift over to the NATO side. First and foremost, and this is consistent regardless of whether you're talking about the US administration, President Macron, Boris Johnson, the German Chancellor, everybody is speaking with one voice, and it is about the safety and protection of NATO nations, not 1 inch of NATO soil. And some will say, well, why? Why is that so important? It's important to Europe for their security, and it's important to America for our economy. We are closely coupled to Europe in a whole variety of economic fashions. And when you look at the economic throw weight, like you would look at military firepower, the economic throw weight of Europe, which includes the UK and the United States, far outweighs anything our competitors can bring to bear. So we need to ensure the safety of that economic sphere of influence that collectively we have. First objective. Second objective is to reinforce Ukraine with the ability to impede Russian aggression. There's a fiscal component to this, there's a humanitarian component to this, and there's a military component to this. The military component is closely coupled to the third objective, and that is containing the war inside the geographic confines of Ukraine. And so when people talk about humanitarian corridors, when they talk about no-fly zones, as great as they would be in terms of preserving Ukrainian lives, they don't come without a tremendous amount of risk. And that risk is either NATO soldiers or NATO or American soldiers shooting and killing at Russian soldiers and Russians doing likewise back at NATO. Because a no-fly zone isn't just a bunch of fighters sitting back over NATO territory saying don't fly. It is support aircraft that have to fly inside of missile envelopes that are positioned in Russia that have the reach over the Ukraine to ensure that you can't impose a no-fly zone if the Russians don't want to. So you got to go neutralize that threat before you even put the no-fly zone in place. You've got to physically attack geography inside of Russia. So, while these ideas sound good and may make nice sound bites, if one of your goals is containing the war to the Ukraine border, a lot of these ideas, at least right now, maybe not necessarily in the future, but right now, the risk reward is way, way too high. And it's responsible leadership that can say, no, we're just not going to go there, despite the slings and arrows that might come in their direction. Okay, Fourth objective, prepare for a long-term confrontation with Russia. This is going to go on for a while. This is not going to end anytime soon. And this will morph into the great power competition between the democracies and the authoritarian nations. Lastly, has been the ability to demonstrate a very, very large cost to be imposed on Russia for the cost of aggression. And this is the democracies coming together saying, hey, if you do this, if you play this far outside of the rules, there are deterrent activities separate from the military dimension which you are going to now have to be willing to leap over because we've demonstrated what we can do. And I've got a couple other things that I was going to talk about, but given the time, I can see Steph there nodding. I think I'll pause here, and I'm very happy to answer any of the other questions during questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, listen, as always, I just learned a tremendous amount for talking to my colleagues. And what I want to do is I want to try to navigate some of the questions that are in the queue. And sincere apologies if I don't get to your particular question, and also just urge particular restraint on our panel. Try to give us your one-liner sentence to some of these questions. I'm going to go in reverse order, though, Charlie, and re-engage you for a second on a question which comes up in a variety of forms. And that is, are there conditions under which the military resupply of Ukraine from NATO territory would actually be seen as a threat of adequate magnitude that Putin would feel he needed to respond to it? You know, obviously, I agree with you completely on a no-fly zone, but is there some, red line where continued resupply would itself be seen as a challenge to Putin?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's something that we have to continuously reevaluate. One of the things that I do is I look at how much noise an opponent is making. In this case, Putin. The more he is threatening, the more he is leaning forward, what that really means is we are really having an effect on him. When I say we, I mean NATO, and in particular, the Ukrainians are really having an effect on his ability to achieve his objectives. Having said that, you do have to be careful, because at some point, where do you draw the line? Is it a system going across the border? Is it individual people from Romania, Bulgaria, Germany, America, mercenaries who want to go and fight? We're going to see the reverse happen with forces from Syria, forces from Grozny, and we could see Ukraine become this crucible of a multinational, multi-axis cauldron of violence, which is really despicable. And then at what point does the resupply of that either become unethical for us or something that Russia says, not this time? So it's a very, very good question. It's something that you have to watch all the time.
Yeah, that's a great answer. By the way, Charlie, I just thought your outline of the different scenarios for how this might go was masterful. You should write that up in an editorial and send it to the UT. Carolyn, I want to come back to you on a question that we have in several forms that is really interesting to me, which is your perverse effect of sanctions point. Is it possible that isolating Russia from the world economy actually has a deeply perverse effect in aligning Russia not only with China, but with a sort of parallel economic universe, which is outside the reach of the West? Think of antimatter, the anti-SWIFT, the anti-energy markets, the anti-financial markets, settlement in the renminbi. I mean, a whole series of things that might decouple the world economy as a result of sanctions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And another way it could happen that I didn't mention is as Shell and BP and others who are invested there pull out and the currency is so depreciated, it's a fire sale for those who want to get invested. So I think we could very well end up in this kind of parallel universe, as you put it, where we accelerate the decoupling into the West and the East, or however you want to, democracies and non-democracies, with some countries being caught in the middle, like India, which in this case has been quite unclear.
Yeah. Great. Lauren, we do not shy away from controversial questions in the Q&A. I want everyone to know that. You did get a bit of pushback on your observation that perhaps Putin believed he had accomplished a lot of his objectives with Trump without having to flex military muscle. Can you just say a couple more sentences about what you think he saw himself getting out of the relationship with Trump and whether you think that narrative is warranted?
Yeah, so I don't think that actually it's appropriate necessarily to focus on Putin, Putin's objectives with Trump or necessarily the U.S. case at all. I think the U.S. was just one piece of the puzzle here. I think, as Branislav pointed out, Brexit was also something he watched really closely. He's also been funding extreme right parties throughout Europe, supporting democratic backsliding in countries in Europe. So I view actually the U.S. piece of this as part of that broader play. And my point with the Trump example was just to say, I think some of those activities were in an attempt to achieve some of these goals in protecting his regime at a lower cost way. And so if he could achieve sowing chaos in democracies around the world and also potentially testing Ukraine to see how cooperative they would be with his regime, that he could see a way to do this at a lower cost, or at least be able to understand the parameters better for his intended goals. And I think this is an outgrowth of some of those observations that he had in the last 5 years.
Great. Well, I'm not sure if we necessarily satisfied your questioner, but at least we didn't shy away from it. Branislav, your academic work, I always think of you, whenever I think of you, I think of the expression talking while fighting, and the idea that, in wartime, you're fighting, but you're also looking for what the off-ramp is going to look like. Can you say something about what it is that Putin might be doing with respect to extracting a settlement of some sort? Or is it more in line with Charlie's observation that we don't know where this is going to end because he doesn't know where it's going to end?
Well, I think Putin's, a lot of his foreign policy is often opportunistic. It's not as carefully planned as people often portray it to be. And when he sees opportunities, he grabs them, and sometimes would retreat if he sees that it's too difficult. But here the problem is, I think his minimum goal is to essentially ensure that Ukraine is Russian, right? When he went in. And that makes negotiations extremely difficult. They're going to negotiate right now, of course, because they're trying to essentially undermine the morale of the Ukrainians by dangling the possibility that they won't be shot and bombed at. He will try to disunite the West by saying, well, look, if you just press Zelensky and these guys, we can get a settlement. But I actually don't think that he's one of my kind of takes on this is that he's been getting pretty bad advice for the reasons that information doesn't travel vertically in these kind of systems very well. So he may not actually know exactly the extent of what's unfolding in Ukraine. So I don't think he's moderated his positions. I mean, the fact that the Ukrainians would not even release some of the details about what the Russians were demanding is telling me that these are some very expansive demands given what's happened on the ground. So from my perspective, his attempt to coerce with a shock and awe, basically go in, the regime collapses, we're done in a few days, then it would have been very difficult for the West to organize sanctions against this. Fait accompli is very difficult to deal with. And then he would have a regime installed in Kiev that can kind of do the nasty operations afterward with Russian support, of course. Now that's failed. And I think he's reverted to the Grozny essentially and Aleppo strategy, which is to increase the pain on the Ukrainians, to force the government to essentially capitulate to avoid the mass casualties. And of course, with this, they're going to have their kind of insincere offers of peace, I think, all along. So they can put, like, with these corridors that they offered, and then they started shelling. And of course, predictably, they claimed that the Ukrainians were doing this. So this is all playbook kind of stuff, right? So I'm very pessimistic about the prospects for a negotiated settlement right now.
Branislav, I'm just going to go back around the horn, but I'm going to start with the nuclear alert on the Russian side. Can you comment on that? And Charlie, if you want to jump in on this one too. This seemed an incredibly risky thing to do to me, but how does it make sense in terms of NATO objectives? It seems somewhat incredible to me, but of course, the Russians have a tactical view of how nuclear weapons might be used. So, or they include a tactical use, I should say. Do you have a comment on that?
Do you want me to go or Bratislav?
I'll let you fight it out.
Oh,
Charlie, go ahead. You jumped in.
Okay. Hey, the short answer is it's a distraction. It is something put up there that is significant. You can't ignore it, and it's going to consume X amount of energy in decision-making circles to ensure that it doesn't come to pass. Having said that, it really is a distraction for other things that are going on, secondary, perhaps strategic cyber, and the horrific attacks that are going on inside of Ukraine. So much of what Putin does is done under the guise of disinformation, whether it's lying, cover, concealment, deception. It is the going forward to ensure that your attention is elsewhere while he's achieving his objective. In the end, possibly nuclear weapons, probably no. And so that's the piece that you gotta have to parse. It's also interesting that that Putin played his biggest hand so early on. 2017, he came out with his nuclear strategy, with a strategy of escalate to de-escalate. I'm going to use nuclear weapons, and now if you want to escalate, then you got to come back with nukes to me, and I don't believe you have the resolve to do that. That's the logic behind Putin's escalate to de-escalate. He put that out there, people cogitated about it. We probably knew this was coming. Can't ignore it, but don't be distracted to it.
Yeah. That's great. Well, listen, there's an actor here that we've completely ignored so far, and that's the Russian public. And this is something Branislav and Lauren, I want to get you in on, because I think you have somewhat different perspectives on. But Lauren, why don't you start? Then there was a fascinating piece in the New York Times the other day about an individual a Ukrainian, who was calling his parents and trying to explain to his parents what was going on in Ukraine. And his parents were saying, no, that's not true. That's not what's happening in Ukraine, which struck me as just, a really striking story. Can the protests have any effect on what Putin is doing? And I do want to get your take on this as well, Branislav, but let me start with Lauren.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely think we should be viewing what's happening domestically in Russia through the lens of a regime that has almost, complete control over the media environment and the ability to shape information, shape the narrative. And so but there are not, there are loopholes, there are leaks, right? There are ways to get through to people. But then people also have to be open to that information. So I think those two things can lead to a large majority of the public not fully being aware, or not even really wanting to be aware of the extent of what's happening in Ukraine. In terms of the protest actually having an effect, I'm pessimistic on this in the same way that Branislav is, which is I don't see there being much threat to Putin's hold on power from the domestic public, from the oligarchs, from the military. I think if there's one thing we can be assured of that Putin has tried to do, it's to insulate himself from those threats. And those are the three kind of main threats: the economic elite, the military elite, and the domestic unrest. And my guess is he has all of that pretty well under control. But this is also a situation where oftentimes we're surprised by these regime overthrows. So I think it's, again, unlikely, but we can see some of these cascades in history. And this could be one of those situations, but it's probably unlikely.
Branislav, I know you have a particular take on this. Do you want to say something on this question?
Well, with these regime stuff, everything works until it doesn't. And then it's a completely sudden and unexpected collapse. So the thing that it's not that our information are telling that what's going on in Ukraine would kind of is going to have this dramatic effect. Although, I mean, remember, during the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, they were beamed constantly. People were listening to them surreptitiously. The few who cared knew, but it did not really have enough of an effect to affect kind of a mass enough movement until the regime started to disintegrate already. However, what will bite in Russia quite a bit, and what Putin cannot hide, is the disintegration of the Russian economy, which is very fast. The sanctions are unprecedented. They're having a tremendous bite. China will not be able, I think, or willing to have the unlimited support to backstop it, really. And as a result, it will be increasingly hard to hide from the Russians the problem. With Western businesses withdrawing, places like IKEA closing doors, you can't hide this. You, of course, will try to spin it. I mean, the Russians are now moving all their domains and internet connections to try to move all the servers' addresses into Russia to kind of cut off Russia from the internet because they can't do a great firewall. They don't have the manpower like China to censor it. So they're trying to do the Iranian thing that they did for a couple of weeks there for a while to prevent the flow of information. But the body bags will start coming home. They already have. And the Russian losses in Ukraine right now are frightening. Even if half of what the Ukrainians are saying is correct, it's just on crazy, crazy losses. And you should remember the devastating effect the truth about the losses in Afghanistan had on the Soviet regime back then. So right now, I think the idea that the Russian protests will kind of topple the regime, I think that is not really a possibility. However, getting enough protests so popular discontent might actually start the circle around Putin, might start to wobble because they stand to lose a lot. So whether this ends up with some kind of palace coup or not, it's impossible to foretell. I do not think that you should expect him to just be toppled by demonstrations in the streets, though.
Yeah. Well, Carolyn, as our dean, I want to come back to you to close with a question and maybe set up a little bit of some daylight between our panelists. I understood your presentation to suggest that you think that the Russians might be able to weather this economically. And, you know, the central bank, the governor of the Russian central bank is an incredibly talented woman who has been part of a quite successful macroeconomic strategy over the last decade, which includes, you know, significant provisioning, significant reserves, fiscal balance, export surplus, and so on. But I'm of the mind that this could actually unravel very quickly, in part because of the uncertainty that the sanctions are creating, as well as the sanctions themselves. Can you give me your positive scenario that they can kind of last this out, and maybe your more negative scenario that this is really, you know, they're in for more than they thought they were?
Yeah, I think they're in for more than they thought they were, but I think they can weather it. And that's where I guess my view is a little different from Bronislav's, in the sense that Russia is a pretty self-sufficient economy. It's been shifting back to the state. Imports are 20% of GDP. It's not an economy hugely, hugely dependent on imported necessities. In 2014, there was a very similar decline in the ruble. They weathered those sanctions and they remained in place. I think what's different this time is the private response, the grassroots type response, where companies on their own are kind of saying they don't want to deal with Russia. Some don't want to import oil, even though it's permitted, because they're afraid maybe in future when it is gonna come, there's gonna be a problem, or they just don't want to be seen trading with Russia. I think that chilling effect may be a little bit different and more extensive, but you know, the goods they trade are very, very substitutable. And there are a lot of countries that desperately need them, especially when the price gets to $150 a barrel and they'll offer it at a discount. So I do think they can weather this. And as you said, Steph, their macro has really been flawless, their macro management. And so they're coming into this in a prepared situation. So no, it's not going to be easy, but this is a population that's pretty used to suffering. So I think sanctions aren't really a good, I mean, they aren't equal to tanks, and that's going to be the problem here. But this has been great, and thanks for all the panelists for joining.
Yeah, well, listen, let me just close by a personal note. You know, one of the great pleasures of being at GPS is to have such smart colleagues with whom we can disagree. Those of you who want to see future webinars that we do, please get on the GPS website. We do things on China, on the Korean Peninsula, on Japan. We'll be having something on the Korean election. We're going to do another thing on China next week, and also the other things going on at UCSD. But thanks very much to all of you for joining, and hope you have a good evening.